What is up, my people? My name's Anton and welcome back to September. Today we're going to be getting to know Redshift a little bit, and I'm going to be taking you through how you can create this perfect looping animation inside of Cinema 4D. Welcome back, everybody. It's been a little break. I've had a pretty busy Christmas over here with uni work and you know what, but you know what, 2023 is going to be an interesting year with a lot of potential, and we're back and better than ever. I hope you guys are sticking with us. We got a lot of new content coming your way. We're going to be kicking it off with a little bit of Redshift work. So I was sort of debating how I was going to structure this video, and I'm going to take it from an angle from obviously the Octane tutorials that I was doing before. We're going to be sort of evaluating it a little bit like getting to know the new render engine and a few of the parallels and sort of different setups that you might encounter along your way. Luckily, their setup is pretty similar. It's nothing too crazy. We've been working a lot with simulations in the past, and it's along the same lines. But we're going to be working with materials, and I'll show you guys how you can render it out and eventually composite it. So without any further ado, I hope you enjoy. And in true September style, we're just going to hop straight into C4D. So we're working with R26 again, like normal. And we're going to start completely from scratch here, and I'm going to show you just a few of the ways that you can set up your scene just to get things working smoothly. Sweet. So back here, first thing we want to do is we want to make sure we're setting our renderer here to Redshift. This is important, obviously, since Redshift was integrated with Cinema 4D thanks to Maxon. We're not working with an external plugin here, so pretty much all of your entire interface is already pre-built in here. It's kind of hidden, so initially what we will kind of want to do is get our render view up. I'm aware we're not rendering yet, but just so you know it's there. You've got a little Redshift tab that appears when you actually select it as your renderer. And a lot of your assets or sort of things you're going to be using are here in the, like, these are your sort of environmental rigs. You've got your camera here, and you've got your lighting points just here. And you've got a few tags that you need to be aware of as well. But that's essentially what you're working with inside of Redshift. So if we hop over here, if we're going about creating the animation, the first thing we want to do is model the little sort of like tabs, I call them, which we're going to be throwing about. So we do that super quick. That's nothing new to us. What we can do is grab ourselves a cylinder, shrink this down a little bit, something along the lines of this. And let's up the rotation segments ever so slightly. So we're working with something a little smoother. And what we want to do is we want to create a little line, almost like a break tab, just to add a little bit of interest. We're working with a glass material, so we're going to have the transmission and refraction up. So we kind of want something to, you know, add a little more interest, if that makes sense. So the way we're going to do that is just bake this off really quick. So we're hitting C. We're going to just work this into a geometry. We can take a look at what our faces look like so far. Nothing too crazy. What we're about to do is create the outline of what we want that break tab to look like. Super easy, but I literally just grabbed a cylinder, set this to about 5, just rotated this, not that direction, but this way. It's about 90 degrees. Moved it up just so it's sitting about on the halfway line here. And then we shrunk this down to a point, something like this. And of course we use volume builder because it's the easiest way to get around this, just to drop these two in, making sure we're lowering the voxel size a little bit and setting the capital to subtract, so that we get a really rough idea there. But what you'll see is, or if we drop that into the mesher, we'll get that break line sort of in there. And as far as the modeling, the geometry goes, we're going to stick with something pretty simple like this. If you want this a little smoother, we can see that we're getting a little bit of roughness around here. You can add a SDF smooth just here, and you see it's going to have a pretty profound effect. So the way the strength works here is that you're almost better off reducing the voxel size to null the strength of this a little bit. Otherwise it's going to be too strong, especially if you're working with quite a small geometry. So if we just up this maybe to 90 now, we're working with a nicer, smoother little thing here. If you don't like how deep this is, we still have the ability to sort of like drag this in a little bit like that. If you want to create a more warped effect, we can hit C just to turn that into the geometry and scale this up ever so slightly. So we're working with something a little softer like this, which might look a little better. So if you're happy with that, we can go on our volume measure, hit C, and now we're working with pretty much what our final geometry is. It's up to you at this point if you want to, well, it's up to you at this point if what you want to do is UV it and add anything cool. With mine, I have these ever so slight logo displacements on the side with the IX. It's up to you, but if you were to do that, you'd obviously have to UV it just to get it positioned right. I'm going to do that for the sake of this, just so I'm replicating this exact render, but that is of course your choice. If we take a look here, what our UVs look like for this little tab, they are all over the gaff. So we need to make sure we delete them. Head over to Paint Wizard. For now, this will do the job pretty well. Make sure you're hitting next, optical cubic mapping, and setting both of these values to 4096. So we're working with some nice definition, and fingers crossed, this should work nicely. So we've got some ever so slight warping here, but hopefully it's not too bad. What we can do is take a little draw here to make sure that the UVs are working. If we turn this around, we can see. So it depends what you want to do, but we can work a little something like that. So now what you want to do is obviously take this into Photoshop where you can actually put some textures on. And then once that's finished, we can get straight into Redshift. I've done this before, but I'm going to do it one more time just to show if we want to get these UV maps into Redshift or UV maps into Photoshop even, so we can put some textures on. What you want to make sure you're doing is heading to the face. Make sure you're showing faces here. Click Control A on your keyboard so these will go yellow, and then head to just here, layer, and then fill polygons. What that's going to do is fill every layer as white. It's complicated, but Cinema 4D has a bit of a intricacy sort of layer manager down here somewhere. It's hidden at the moment, but it's the layer manager which works with UVs. And if you try export it straight off, it won't actually show these UV guys that are showing on the screen now. You need to make sure you fill the polygons, and then that acts as a second layer. It's kind of, it needs a little bit of work, but you know what, it does the job for now. If we head to file here, and now if we click save texture, make sure we're heading to PSD, click OK, and we can just find what we're doing. I'm just going to replace this one because that should be fine. That PSD is going to save. So if we now head to here and just double click on the PSD we just saved, we're going to open up in Photoshop, and pretty quick we should get those UVs ready to go. So we can see that we've got some very slight warping here. It's only just a little smaller on the vertical axis. So what we're going to have to do is, if you're planning a logo here, you're going to have to sort of bear that in mind. My workaround for this is this. So if we head over and find what we want to use, so let's take a look here. We can hop right into here. We can grab our logo, drop it in, make sure we're inverting it so we're getting a little bit of contrast, and let's rasterize this, drop this down so it fits. And you'll see if we just left it at this, it probably would work, but the logo will be warped. So what we want to do is this. What we want to do is grab ourselves a uniform circle, and then we can do that by clicking anywhere and making sure we're hitting Alt and Shift on our keyboard, and that's going to make sure it pins to a perfectly uniform circle. We can make this any size, or make it roughly the same size as these circles here. Making sure we're in a new layer, we can now hit Fill, make sure we're going black, which is perfect. Grab our logo, invert that so we can actually see it again. And now the way you got to think about it is these two are now uniform together. So if we just pin that to the middle like this, you've got a nice little locking mechanism in Photoshop, which is nice. Make sure that looks good. What we can do is just hit Control G to group these two layers. Move this down so that you're sort of positioning this edge here where that UV is, and then hit Shift and then click the top to warp it down. And what you will see is what we can do is match that background black circle to the white one that we see here. What that's going to do is, not only do we have that lock-in mechanism for putting the logo in the middle on top of that black circle, but we also have them grouped together and they will warp to the same extent. So what you'll get is a warped logo to that UV. This is a terrible workaround for the fact that I couldn't be bothered to get the UV maps done perfectly, but you know what? It does the job perfectly. And there we have a warped logo. So if we grab ourselves a new background here, we can just, fill this with white. We have a map here that we can use for displacement, bump, roughness, whatever you like. In this case, we're going to use displacement because I sort of figured out that looked the best. And we can now go about exporting this. So if we just quick export as PNG, we can head to, let's go tabs. Let's just make a little text folder. Just going to make a new text folder just there. And we can make this displacement. Cool. That's going to save off, and then our Photoshop work is essentially done from that point. So let's just save no for now. We can go back into here, and that's our texture. So now we can get out of this horrible UV mode and just hop into Redshift real quick. And if we start the IPR, which is essentially the progressive instant render, which you can sort of work with, we'll be able to see what we got here. We can delete this material that got generated because of the UV edit. Any sec, you'll notice the Redshift coming from a hardcore Octane user here. Redshift is a little slower, only marginally, but generally some of the looks you can get from Redshift actually kind of, they have a little edge on Octane, I've got to say. This depends what kind of look, but we're making digital art here, right? So it kind of, the final look means a lot. And there's a few little things in the work ethic and sort of like a general use case of Redshift that tend to have a little bit of an edge on Octane, especially in the industry now. Everyone's using it, so I figured might as well join. We'll save this up real quick, and we can have a little pan around our geometry and see what this starts to look like. Obviously incredibly boring right now. So firstly, let's just grab ourselves a dome light. So if we hold on the light tab here and then just head to dome light, we can see that we get our familiar sort of setup. What we're going to do now is get a material on this, and then we can start simulating. So just to make sure the UVs work nicely, we can head to the material tab here, hold on the plus, go to materials, and then drop yourself in a standard shader. Now, when you're creating materials, there are a few, obviously with the new Redshift that came out, there are a few different like setups to sort of the node editor that you've got. Mine might not look the same as yours. This is the old Redshift setup that is seemingly a little more popular than the new node-based one. If you want access to this, what you have to do is head to Edit, Preferences, and then under Renderer Redshift, you want to make sure you untick Node Materials or Presets. Another thing is also make sure you untick your CPU here, but you want to make sure you untick Node Materials for presets. And then when you create a new material after that, you'll get this setup. It might be hard to understand why this is a little bit better, but for me, for some reason, it's just a little more familiar. And what you have is your output surface material here, and you have the standard material you just created. And this is where you'll have your base, your color, your refraction, your bump, all that good stuff. And this is where you'll have your displacement. Super rough overview, but generally that's how it works. If we drop this material onto our geometry, we will see that we don't actually see too much because we haven't done anything to the material yet, but we want to make this glass. So easily enough, if we head to our weight and make that 1, this is going to become transparent. Now we can see that we're getting a nice little bit of transparency. Let's grab ourselves a texture that we can use for the HDRI real quick. And then we can go about simulating this and boxing off the loop. So head to HDRIs. I'm not too picky because HDRI seems to look a little better in Redshift. But if we get ourselves maybe a modern industrial sort of nice looking HDRI, we can get one of these, drop it in, nice, HDRI is working. One thing you'll notice straight away about Redshift is that the integration with Cinema 4D itself is much better. We now have a HDRI quite literally in the background of our viewport, which is handy when, say, you want to rotate it or such. So you can literally head into your dome light, go here, and the rotation's it's all there essentially. There's nothing that's being hidden from me, which is pretty cool. So if we want to toggle that visibility off from the camera, we can untick background. Everything's quite intuitive. And you can see that we're left with our glass material on this little piece here. So what we're going to do is we need to change the transmission of this firstly, because we want to kind of colorize this a little bit. So we head into our Redshift standard material. We can go and change the color here to, let's say, a red. Maybe not completely red, but we're going to get a sort of slightly crystally, almost ambery material here. Let's make sure we've got no weight for that base color there. Something I also just briefly forgot here is you want to make sure you're setting your roughness. This is by default in the standard material. Your roughness for the reflection is set to 0.2. If you're using a HDRI like me, you want to make sure you're setting that to 0. And what that's going to do is sort of bring out a lot of the cleaner reflections that you see. It's going to make it look a little less like candy and more like an actual refractive sort of like tablet coin type thing. So yeah, remember that. Sweet. So I've just switched out the HDRI, but we've got the basis for our look here. What we need to do now is we're going to add a little bit of displacement, and I believe the displacement is going to sit right on the back here. So if we just flip this round so we can see what we're doing, we can head into our material and we want to make sure we activate this displacement. So to activate our displacement, we need to do a few steps. We're inside our basic material here with the transmission and color turned up. But But what we want to do is make sure that we're actually bringing this into the node editor. So we need to click here and make sure we've got displacement activated first. Then we can drag our texture in. We don't need to do too much to this, but what we do need is a displacement node here. Just drop the texture on the blue bit and then hit texture like that, texture map scale, drop it into displacement just like that. And then lastly, make sure we right click here, go on render tags and then Redshift object. And what we need to do is make sure we're heading over to geometry, override, and then activate the displacement here. And with a little bit of tweaking, we can see that we're starting to get a little bit of displacement for that logo there. This is where you want to double check if your logo is being displaced inwards or outwards. For me, it is inwards. So of course, we can head over here and drop down an invert node, which should, if we just drop that here, we can put that in between our texture and the input to the displacement map. And we'll see on the left here that our displacement's now gonna head up. This is quite subtle, but I didn't really want to displace too much to the geometry, and it saves obviously doing it to the geometry itself. So we can head into lines mode here and we can see that we're starting to get a nice little bit of displacement, subtle enough to, you know, just add a little something to the geometry itself. But that's how we generate the look. So now we're free to simulate however we like. If we head back here to the right side, we can pause the renderer for a sec and work with what we're used to. So we can head here, let's grab ourselves a camera, make sure we set up the camera and position it just a little like this. What we can do is set our focal length to 80, drag this back a little bit and make sure we're rendering a square format. So maybe 1000 by 1000 is what I used before. We can head back, save up, and what we need to do now is clone this and then create a container that little tab's going to get dropped into, right? So firstly, let's do that. Let's grab ourselves a cube and just size this to about the size of the canvas. If we hop out the camera here, we can see that really that's a pretty perfect shape already. We don't need to do too much to that. So let's just click on the cube, hit C, go into face mode, just select that top face and get rid of it because we don't need it. And now we can get our little volume measure tab here and we can save up and just go about cloning this so that it falls into our container. I believe before the sweet spot was somewhere about 20 to, I just drove the wrong thing in, the volume measure into the cloner, just like this. Make sure we're setting this to linear here. And if we just move this up so we can see what we're dealing with, let's set this to something a little like 50, which seems like a crazy amount, but I think it was about right last time. If we increase the sort of distance here, what that'll mean is we have space to head into the cloner, go MoGraph, Effector, and Random. And what that is going to do is, of course, randomize each entity that we've just created. But the reason we want to do this is so that it looks a little more real and fluid. If we change the values for the rotation to 360 each time, just it applies a random rotation to the whole scale, what you'll see is each of these little tabs are rotated at a different axis, which is perfect because what it means is when we head and look at our container here, they're all going to fall down and hit the container, pile up, and they're all going to be different rotations. So it doesn't look like they're falling like dominoes, if that sort of makes sense. We want to see this falling now, enough talking about it. So if we save this, right click on cloner, head to simulation tags, or rather bullet tags, and then hit rigid body, and right click on the cube and hit bullet tags collider body. It means that the cube is going to be set to a collider, so it's going to be colliding with all the tabs that are falling, and the rigid body being on the cloner is going to mean they're all going to fall in unison. So if we head out here, this is where you can sort of tone this up or down to your advantage. So it's a little procedural, more procedural than normal C4D simulations are. We can increase our time length here. I think about 150 was about the right time before. We can hit play and see what happens. So we're working with fairly dense geometry because of the volume measure here, but I believe before it worked. So if you're having trouble, we might have to go a route where we're sort of remeshing the geometry a little bit, but ideally, perfect. We're getting a nice little topple here. So obviously we're looking at this from the outside. If we look at what our canvas looks like, it's not playing in real time, but we're getting our 20 tabs falling down just like this. Let's head into dual shading. It's working black at the minute. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but it is okay. We've got quick shading, we've got all sorts. Let's set it to this for now. Maybe well, let's keep it like this. You'll see that we're getting our drops. So if you want a little more now, you can double this up to about 50, because I kind of wanted this to fill almost to the top. And if we shoot play again, it might take a little bit of time to process, but what we should get is a nice piling to the top. Beautiful. So we just watched it through, but we got a nice now 50 tabs sort of piling, rotating, jiggling about. It gets a little slower here, sort of bear that in mind, but ideally we're working with a 5-second long animation here if we're rendering at 30 FPS. So what we see is them pile up, sort of bounce about, and then we can go about creating our final element, which is going to be the drop. So that goes to a black screen again, and they can load in again in your looping animation, right? So this is where you have obviously your creative control. You can sort of think about how many do you want. If you want it to pile up more, go for it. It's going to be a little tough on your simulation, but you know what, it should work. If you do have an issue whereby your PC is crashing, what you can do is grab this volume meshing node here, which is currently super dense because the geometry, and you can get a remesh node, which is an R26, drop that in and set your remesh to maybe, I don't know, 50% or something like that, 50 or lower. It's going to reduce that geometry and ideally keep your UVs, and your animation should be pretty fixed if that's actually an issue for you. But for now, what we're going to do is head to just towards the end of the animation here. I'm thinking maybe about 120. What we can do is grab our cube, keyframe it just here, and then go just 10 frames forward. It's invisible at the moment, but of course there is actually a cube there. Drag that down somewhere like this. And what you'll see will happen is, if we make this invisible again, we can hop in here, watch them all pile up, and then close to the end, wherever we keyframed that, what we're going to see is they're going to drop and go out of frame. And what I like is there's a little bounce here, and this drops in between. So what you see is that bounce off the side and then head off, which is cool. What we're going to do for a sec is, one thing that I've realized is that this is me being picky, of course, but there is a tab that falls right at the end, which bounces and then heads off to the right here. And I don't think it falls completely off frame, which is going to ruin the effect of the loop. So this is the one I'm talking about here. And we've got about 20 frames left, but nah, it does seem to work. Cool. So this is looking pretty good, but there's one little touch I'm going to add just to finish this off. And that is a little bit of randomness on the, I believe that's the X axis. So we head into our random here. What I mean by that is we're going to look at our top down view here, and we can see we've got some random rotations. But what I want is a little bit of position, just a touch. But if we head to our first frame here, we can see that we can vary it a little like this. But obviously we want to make sure it stays within these guides. So if we do something maybe a little like this, what that means is we're going to get the same sort of randomness like we did with the rotation, except it's going to be obviously across the axis. Just makes it look a little more varied, I suppose. And creates a little bit of a nicer look. So that's going to change your simulation ever so slightly. Bear in mind, the thing with these simulations is that every little rotation that you make, every little change will ultimately affect the look of your sim. And just like that, this is gone now, but it falls off the frame, so it's fine. Let's increase this to maybe 155 frames, just to be sure that is going to go. And now, if you're happy with that, you can head to cache here and just bake all. And that is going to load in your rigid body sim as a simulation that you can play through your timeline. We can see that we're getting our super fast animation, and it's going to drop out just like that, which is exactly what we want. We can head to hidden line. We're not really getting a lot of depth in our viewport because of the geometry here, but you can see that we've got our working animation and see what that looks like. We can drop out here, take a look in if you want an outside view. But generally, this is exactly what we want. So now we have the ability to go back into Redshift mode and take a little look at what our final render is going to look like. So all of these have the same material applied to them, which means if we head in here, we want to make sure this is toggled completely invisible. We have our tabs that are forming with the displacement, which is perfect. One thing I'm going to do is make sure we're ticking off the background here. And now we can flick through here and see what our look development is sort of looking at. We're getting quite a lot of darkness here. And there's a few ways we can change that. So you can change that inside here, I believe. If you go to your Redshift standard material, you can up the samples here, maybe to something like 10. You can change your scatter color. And you can also head to your Redshift render settings here. And if you go to, is it your combined depth? Yeah, you can set your reflection refraction samples up here. Maybe something a little more. That's obviously going to increase your render time, but that is, if you're getting a little bit of black, sometimes it can be because the passes of the actual rays going through your tabs aren't enough. So that's kind of the complicated way of doing it. What I believe is actually the reason is probably because our dome light here is just shining in a bit of an awkward direction. So if we shoot this a little rotate, what we can probably get is some slight reflections on the side here, which sort of make up for it. What we can see is this. So let's actually brighten this up a little bit. We've only got intensity of 1 so far. So maybe if we set this to 5, we get a little bit of a nicer look here, which I think looks quite cool. You can see what I mean about the displacement. It's almost enough just looking the way it does. And they look a little bit like candy, but here you can see is the look that we're getting at the minute. So you can tone up or down this intensity as you like, but that seems to be the best way of sort of lighting this at the moment. We can make sure we're saving this. And as far as your material creation is going, that is kind of what we're going to go for now. You can tweak your sort of like weight, your samples, like I said, your dispersion, if you want to sort of really make this look cracked out. And you've got a few more settings, which we'll go into at a later date. But for now, this is what we're going to be doing. Just keeping it simple for our first video on Redshift. So a few things rendering this out now is an interesting point, which I figured I'd raise in this video, is that for you guys that have obviously watched all my older videos, I pretty much do all my stuff in Aces. I'm a huge fan of Aces. I think it looks far more realistic, and I got it into my workflow pretty early on, just from like setting it when you were starting to create your scene and create your looks. And then by the time you created your finished render, that's sort of the trick with Aces. You don't want to apply it at the end because everything will look completely dark. You want to do it at the start and then work your way through it. And inside Redshift, it is far easier. So there's nothing that you need to like toggle inside the viewport here just to apply that Redshift sort of tone map to your render view. What you actually have is just a Redshift, where is it? It's in here. I think it's in advanced. You can head to just here, rendering color space, and it's already in Aces, which is great. And what you'll find is when you're rendering this out in the picture viewer, as a contrast to Octane, where you had to import into DaVinci and sort of make sure you're tone mapping it the right way, Cinema 4D would actually do it automatically, and you'd get a much better sort of feedback for what you're working on, which I thought was really cool. So that's just a little touch if you're coming from my older videos and you're wondering why I haven't been raving about Aces. It's because of that. And if you wanted to really polish this off, what you could do is just make sure you're ticking, if you get to basic here, just make sure you tick motion blur. For all intensive purposes in Redshift, I haven't really delved into advanced too much. You don't really need to. A lot of your stuff's kind of here. You're not going to be rendering like this in Final. This is what's called progressive rendering, and you'll be familiar with this if you're coming from Octane. But in Redshift, you only use progressive rendering in the viewport, well, while you're working on your scene. Ideally, what you'll use at the end is bucket rendering, which is a different type, and it all goes around in boxes like this, targeting different areas of the image. It is a way of sort of previewing your full quality image straight away, and it's a little similar to old C4D rendering, if you remember what physical renderer used to be. It's along those lines. What you'll see here is also motion blur doesn't actually seem to be active inside of progressive rendering. Make sure we hit our final render here. So we've got our final render going here, thanks to that little button. And you can see that our motion blur is in fact in effect. And this is what is going to really bring our sort of loop to light and make it loopable. You know, you want to make these things look good so that everyone sort of like flicks and sees it on Instagram and watches it over and over again. And that's how you're going to get that look. Ultimately, it's the content that you create, the polish of it. Massive fan of motion blur. Don't know if you could tell. But this is essentially how you go about creating that loop. We're going to pause this off real quick, and I'm just going to run over a few final little render tips for Redshift so you can render this out and box it all off. So my normal render settings for stuff like this is to head into your output, making sure your whatever resolution, obviously it goes without saying, the higher resolution, your higher your render time. Make sure you set your frame range to all frames here. We're working in exactly the right ratio anyway, so that shouldn't be an issue. Make sure your frame rate set here, and when you're saving, your best bet is to export as a format EXR. You're going to export it as an EXR sequence, and that's what you're going to use. It's like the highest quality 32-bit format to then import either into After Effects or DaVinci, your choice, to then composite off. Don't export as PNG or anything else in C4D. It just isn't worth it. You're pretty much like ripping off or like compressing a lot of the quality that you've created. So you might as well do it if you're going to spend time rendering it. So make sure you open EXR 32-bit per channel. This is your choice here, but if you've got multi-passes, you can create those. You've got a compositing project file if you want to track cameras and stuff, but no need for this kind of thing. And now we have our Redshift render settings. Obviously, we've skimmed over these a little bit, but Redshift does seem to be a little slower than Octane. That is where the sort of mismatch lies a little bit, especially when rendering glass and stuff like this. We're lucky in this scene, all we got is a HDRI, which is turned up quite high. But for the previous render, I had to lower my progressive passes down to something fairly low. So if you are using progressive rendering, I set it to about 200 when the default was 1024. And the rest of these are sort of your choice, but denoising, of course, denoises it. If that's an issue in your render, have a little play. But it's one of them things which sort of is a case-by-case basis. These I sort of roughly explained. And your bucket quality, I'd say keep on medium. Unless you're really struggling, you can move that down to low, but for all intensive purposes, you can keep that on medium, and you are ready to then render. So I hope I explained that well, and I'm hoping you guys enjoy the Redshift content. If there's anything else that you'd like to learn about, please do let me know, because hey, I'm a student, I'm learning too, and I'm just putting out value as much as I possibly can. I've been spending a lot of my spare time recently tinkering around with quite a lot of complex new stuff and new softwares like Houdini, which is a whole rabbit hole in itself. So I will have some very exciting stuff coming very soon. But for now, I hope you guys can put this to cool use, and of course tag me anything cool you create. So we have a few new things coming our way. I don't know how many of you spotted it, but obviously the people that know of September, we got a new little rebrand. We got a nice little new logo, which is a little more versatile. And we got a little bit of a new look coming. And that's because I am all about bringing more value to this channel at the minute. I had a blast for the last month of last year, obviously since I started September uploading. A few, we had quite a good pace on us, and we're bringing that back, but with value this time. So not to say that we're going to be going more on the quality route rather than the quantity, but we're going to be bringing some really exciting stuff to the channel, and I hope you guys are ready for that. So we've always been pretty good at sort of communicating. If there's anything you guys want, if there's anything you guys are interested in or particularly want to learn about, drop it down below, because that is pretty much one of the best ways that I'm going to see. If you want to tag me on Twitter, go for it. We've got an Instagram coming up, so keep an eye on your timelines for that. But you know what? We're bringing September to new levels in 2023. I hope all of you lot are ready. And we've got some pretty cool stuff to make. So let's start making some statements. I'll see all of you guys in the next video. Thank you so much for watching.